Howdy y'all, today we are going to be reacting to more North of the Border. Now, there's a couple videos that I haven't watched, like on here. So I think we're going to start with this one, move to this one, and then this one, if I got enough time.
Today I'm gonna make a poke toad with a great big tongue and an unlucky trainer. Right out the gate, if I'm making a big bulbous toad-like beast, then I really need to start by making a big ball of aluminium. Then I can wrap it in a thin layer of clay, which I'll poke and prod until it all resembles a gray inverse baked potato. All I need to do then is add some texture. However, you're off your head if you think I'm gonna add all that texture by hand. I'm far too lazy for that, which means it's time to make a tool. I've made a number of texture tools already on this channel, and while any of them would work perfectly fine for this model, I wanted to make a new one to pad out the video and rake in more of that sweet ad revenue. Plus, it lets me add tryptophobia to the tags. With my roller in hand and my potato in the other hand, I can start to gently caress the surface until my potato is covered in a fine layer of itty-bitty warts and bumps. All good reptilian textures have a lot of cuts and scores in the surface, so I'm going to add some of my own by wrapping my dragon egg in cling film and then gently scoring it with a knife blade. The cling film helps keep the cuts from being too sharp, and once it's removed, I'm left with a lovely, warty lump of a slightly scarred toad belly. That goes into the oven to cure while I get to work making another gray tato, albeit this time slightly misshapen. You know those wonky veg boxes you can buy at the shop? It's like that except gray and made out of clay. I'll smash this onto the tip of my freshly cured warty ball, blend it all in, then drill a couple of holes for wire legs. Then it's back to the bulking, and before I add any more of that texture, I want to make sure Lickitungue's tail is extra wrinkly and fat, so I'm gonna go ham with the big chunky wormy dealies. Once they're all in place, I can start to smooth and blend them in so they look like they're part of the body. Then I can get to work adding a tail extension to bring the overall shape a bit closer to the original design. Finally, with all the various parts of my tail anatomy in place, I'll give it a final smoothing before hitting it with the tryptophobia-inducing texture roller, followed by the old cling film and knife trick.
That's not a knife, that's a spoon.
I see you've played knifey spoony before.
Then it's time to give this thick-tailed boy some adequately thick thighs, which I'll make by adding more and more lumps of clay until I think it's just about right. The trick here is just to keep adding clay, because when it comes to supporting a body of this girth, you really can't have too much leg. Once I think I've got enough leg, I'll give it a quick smoothing before moving on to making a single thumbnail-sized toenail. I'll bake this in the oven to cure it, then I can jam it into the tip of my toad's toes before building up the surrounding area to blend it all in. Then it's back to my holy roller before getting to work making a great big bulbous toad gob. Of course, this big gob needs a neck to attach to, so I'll lay down some lumpy clay foundation so that I can attach a kind of reptile-looking upper jaw. This then gets blended into the aforementioned neck foundation before adding a matching bottom portion of my jaw. His neck's not quite rolly enough, so some more wormy dealies will thicken up his already substantial gullet, and some wrinkles around the top of his head will help to blend the top and bottom of the torso together. I'll use my clay Scoopy Dealy to remove the majority of the mouth from inside the mouth, then my ball styluses will help to reshape and reform the head, pushing it ever closer to a somewhat recognizable creature. Now, because this particular Lickitung is going to be swallowing the remnants of an unlucky black-gloved Pokemon trainer, I figured it's worth taking the time to make the inside of his mouth nice and gnarly looking. This is mostly achieved by poking and prodding with various ball styluses until it's unsettlingly fleshy looking. Otherwise, with the inside of my mouth looking bad, which is good, I can poke some shallow holes to drop some beady little eyeballs into, then build up the rest of the head shape. I'll make sure to give his eyes lots of wrinkles so as to ensure the existence of his nictitating membranes, then I'll poke some big breathing holes in the front of his face before adding some random lumps and dips and hitting it all with some ever-important texture roller. Now at this point, I decided that while he's got a pretty chunky neck, it's not nearly chunky enough, so I'm going to add some great big vocal sacs and extra thick blobs of clay to the underside of his jaw until his head is roughly the size of his body. This all, of course, gets some texturizing, then I'll tickle the tips of his lips with some added texture before getting to work making his little T-Rex arms. Much like his single-nailed toes, his arms only have a single claw, which I pre-baked off camera and jammed into the tips of his arms. I'll then add some pre-texture mini wrinkles, followed by post-mini wrinkle texturing, before coming back through and adding copious wrinkles and fat rolls all around the arms, legs, and tail connections, as well as some choice wrinkling around the rest of his body.
He is kind of chunky though, so.
Otherwise, once all my freshly rolled wrinkles have been texturized, it's time to make a prehensile murder tongue. I'll start with a big lump of clay that I can roll and pinch until it's a thick flatworm of clay. I'll then embed a length of armature wire into the middle of my tongue, which will help me to give the tongue a bit of shape and support it while it's baking. Some more clay gets added on until I've got an appropriately tongue-shaped shape upon which I can start to add the texture. I'll start by smoothing the entire surface out, then drawing the dividing line down the center of the tongue and pressing the clay until it's got a bit more of a central dip. Then I can fold and bend the tongue until I've got a nice action pose, and a series of progressively smaller ball styluses will help to add the initial tongue texture. The tongue then gets jammed into the mouth, and once it's nice and secure, I can start to add the finer surface details. The tongue is going to very much be the central focus of this particular model, so I want to take the time to make it look as realistic as possible. Otherwise, with my tongue in place, that's the sculpting finished, which means it's time to paint, which means it's time to prime.
Optimus Prime. Casper.
With my albino base coat in place, it's easy enough to start building up the layers of pink. A nice thin layer of watered down pink will be
Dude,
my...
I shit you not. So, he said albino. Albino is a white animal, right? Or an animal that usually isn't white but turns white. I shit you not, I was walking out back, like, during the night the other day, right? And I had the feeling I was being watched. And I look over, like, it's like a decent way away, so I get binoculars. And I could just barely see antlers on this white object. There's an albino deer on my property. Yes, you heard me correct. An albino deer. Here, let me look up the chances of there being an albino deer. One in 30,000. Let me try to find a picture of what it looked. It didn't look like this completely. I'm making a video, so don't say any racist comments like saying that child was a monkey at one time. That's a joke. She's not racist. I am. It looked like this. It just looked so weird because everything just didn't look right. Like, it usually just looks like this, right? But I just see that staring at me, and it's like super weird. What? I know, if I want...
my base coat, and I'll follow that up by
it's, like,
strategic
super cool to see,
sponging
'cause it's,
of
like,
slightly
super
lighter
rare.
shades of pinks to help break up some of the one-tone pink coloring. I'll then follow that up by hitting it with a nice light pink dry brush to help highlight all the bumps and warts and excessive texturing I did during the sculpting. Finally, a quick sponging of an almost white pink on the tips of the wrinkles and rolls, and I can get to work giving the inside of the mouth a series of reds, pinks, purples, and blues until it's kinda mouth fleshy. Then I'll get to work making my way through a series of reds and pinks on the tongue.
Hey,
At
can you
this
tell me
point,
with
I've
some art
sponged everything
projects,
else,
buddy?
so in keeping with tradition, a bit of sponging on the tongue to close it out before moving on to my fingers and toes. My quartet of nails gets an initial bone white base coat, before then tickling the tips with a white wet blend to add a little bit of gradient. I'll then mix up a little yellow and bone white to give me a slightly yellowish bone white color that I can then use to add the rounded markings on Lickitungue's chest as well.
Alright, let's skip to this part.
I'll start with an MDF disc and give it a nice coat of black paint. Now, any good swamp needs mud, and to make my mud, there are 3 key ingredients: hole filler,
Mud.
brown paint, and glossy Mod Podge,
Or
and a
just
mixing
mud.
cup. First thing is to fill the
I
cup
thought
with an
you
appropriate amount of vanilla ice cream, then add lots of chocolate sauce and a sprinkle of Mod Podge. And once you mix it all together, you're left with a delicious looking cup of coffee colored goop. To add a little bit of texture, I'm going to dump in some ground up plant debris.
It's actually really good.
My mixture's then ready to get slapped onto the base and spread out until the whole surface is covered. This particular hole filler will cure up.
Quick little story time. So I was making an art project, right? And we were doing animal sculpts. So I chose to do a red panda. And so, well, what we didn't choose, we had to. This was when I was in middle school with Miss Martin. So we're sculpting red pandas, right? And I look over, I see this girl's. It's just perfect, like spot on. It's like the best one in class. And I look at mine. It looks like a red panda that got hit with a semi-truck and had autism. Like, it was just messed up in every single way. Like, I brought it home, and, like, my first initial thought was just burn it immediately. Like, get it out of this world. But my mom wouldn't let me burn it. Yes, I'm looking at you.
That's because everything you do is special. Except for bad stuff.
Hey, no. You heard it from her first. Everything I do is special. You didn't hear the last part.
Except for bad stuff.
No, even including bad stuff. Everything has a meaning. Well,
Up to
everything
70
has a meaning in my dreams.
5 millimeters deep, so I can apply it nice and thick without worrying that it won't cure. I'll add a little surface detritus by way of more ground up tree bark and a little bit of foliage before finally sticking my Lickitung in place. The hole filler will harden around his feet, keeping him nice and secure, but before it does that, I'll brush a bit of mud up onto his legs and tail. Otherwise, before we call this one good, I need to make a trainer. Fortunately, I don't need to make much of a trainer
Isn't
since
more
the
that
plan is to have
Pokemon
my
crap?
hapless victim hanging out of the
Whatever
side
it's
of my
called.
Lickitung's
Pokemon,
mouth, which means
Pokemon.
I really only need to make an arm. Not only that, but I don't really need to add a great deal of detail to said arm since I randomly and totally unrelated to any character at all.
So we have a baby cow. We had a couple baby calves born. Mom, when was Daisy born? Like, how far apart were Daisy and Elliot born?
One was born in January, one was born in
March.
March.
So I think Daisy was born in January, and Elliot was born in March. Elliot's the new baby calf. And usually, like, I try to show them I'm not a threat. I won't harm them. But we also been needing to castrate Elliot, so that's been kind of hard, to do. But so he was sleeping, right? And I didn't end up castrating him. I probably should have, or at least tried to grab him, but all the cows were standing around him. And I was like, this would be a perfect time to get a really good picture of him. He's like asleep and in boots on gravel. I walked over there very, very, very quietly. Took this great picture, turned around, walked away. He did not even flinch. Not a single bit. And then, so when we first came back to Spencer, so I was scared of the cows because I seen my, dog that, he was like my best friend that, almost got trampled to death by him. So I've just been, scared of him forever because, I just, watched him almost kill my fucking dog. So, I would never get in there. I'd be scared of him. And then, one day I showed my mom this picture. She's like, were you in there with him? I was like, yeah, what? She goes, I thought you were scared of him. I'm like, not anymore. All the cows are around me. We have, 2 bulls, I think. And they're, the one with the yellow tag, it's pissy. It's like me on a bad day. It don't like anyone. And Frosty, our oldest heifer, I seen her, I had them all in my peripheral vision, line of sight from this way to this way. I just see Frosty out of the corner of my eye walking towards me, kind of moving her head around like this. I turned, I said, don't you even think about it. So she went back to eating, and, like, I'm sitting on the ground. Like, so I was trying to show them I'm not a threat. And Bella, I mean, she's my little buddy. There's Bella right there. Here, I don't know if you guys can see it that well. She kind of started playing with me a little bit. But she seen I was sitting on the ground, so she was kind of like trying to knock me over and crap. I mean, they're great animals, but all of them will do anything to protect a baby, so. She was kind of grumpy that day as well, so. But yeah, I love those animals now, so. Alright, back to the video, I guess.
Decided that said arm will be wearing a full arm-length black glove. Again, in a totally unrelated design choice, I figured maybe this particular trainer would have a history of trouble with this particular Lickitung, so I'm going to make a teeny tiny Pokeball to drop at its feet, as if to imply that maybe this was a failed attempt at summoning an already caught paralysis toad. Painting the arm is nice and easy since, you know, it's just black on black with a little gray dry brush for highlighting, and the Pokeball gets standard Pokeball styling before getting dropped into the mud in front of Lickitung's feet. And the arm gets attached, so it's hanging out the side of Lickitung's mouth, and I can add the final finishing touches, starting with a coat of high-gloss varnish on the tongue and inside the mouth, followed by some extra goopy drooly bits by way of Uhu. This is a transparent adhesive that I found works exceptionally well for goopy drooly bits. Since it dries clear, it can be built up in layers, and if you work back and forth or poke it with a toothpick, you can get some really gnarly, slimy saliva strings. Otherwise, once my glue's dried, that's us finished here and on to the glamour shots.
Lickitung, I choose you!
Fuck. Wow, this turned out great. I don't like the music though.
A huge shout out to the best patrons on the internet, and a very special shout out to the newest of them, Josh Gorst, Lily, Aben Walters, Quinn, Adam Beeston, Chester Humbert, Oscar
This is like he has fucking talent. There's no other way to put it. I could probably watch one more video. So, I guess I could watch this one. I really do like Jurassic World, so I'm gonna watch this.
Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and if you're watching this on March 10th, then today is March 10th, which means today is Mario Day. And in honor of Chris Pratt being Mario, I thought, why not make Mario
is Chris Pratt
be
actually Mario?
Chris Pratt?
Hold on. Oh my god, he actually is. That's crazy. Jack Black's Bowser? Oh, I mean, he's kind of, yeah. I can see that as Toad. That's crazy. Wow, okay.
Full disclosure, my original plan was to make Chris Pratt, but give him a sweet flavor saver, dope overalls, and an awesome red hat. But I am well aware of my sculpting skill level, and I know I don't have the chops to make an adequately accurate mustached Pratt in just a week and have it look anything remotely like what I want it to. In fact, it would probably be hard to make it look even remotely human. I am, however, quite confident in my ability to make Mario in the allotted time and have him looking at least borderline recognizable. I would assume this is because I've made him so many times, but if my copious longs, lanks, and lunks are anything to go by, then it's gotta be something else. As a quick side though, I apologize if it looks like I'm using toenails for Mario's eyeballs, but I ran out of white clay and I had to use translucent clay, which is the usual color I use when making teeth or toenails. If it didn't look like that before I said it, and I've made this video infinitely more unsettling by drawing attention to it, then I'm sorry again. I'm also sorry for this picture. Probably one of the biggest reasons Mario's so easily recognizable is because he's got that sweet, sweet flavor saver that's pretty much his most important character trait, alongside, of course, his accent, but that's a little bit harder to show in sculpture format. I want Mario to be pulling a cheeky face in appreciation of the situation he's found himself in, so I'll build up a bit of extra scale skin around his right eye, then pinch his face a bit to give him a bit of a sly look. Of course, the absolutely massive caterpillar eyebrows come in handy here to expand on that look, and once they're in place, I can start to add the final surface texture to his stash and brows before sticking some little coins of clay onto the side of his head to make his great big hearing holes. Finally, I'll give the pink fleshy parts a quick brushing with isopropyl alcohol to remove any fingerprints or tool marks, and I'm ready to add his body. As I always do when doing Mario, I like to make his body in sections, starting with his upper torso. I'm not going to be adding much detail yet, since all I want to do are get his arms and belly in place so that I can attach some little aluminium legs. I rolled out some teeny tiny balls of brown clay that I'll smoosh and flatten and poke and prod until I've got a pair of adorable little leather combat boots. Once they've been baked in the oven to cure them, I can drill a little leg hole on the top and then stick my Mario in place using a little CA glue before getting to work bulking up his blue jeans. This particular Mario isn't going to be sporting his usual red shirt and blue overalls, but instead he's going to be getting a movie-accurate rendition of Pratt's all-American dino wrangling outfit, complete with a pair of extremely wrinkly blue jeans. It feels kinda wrong making Mario without light blue overalls, but I feel like Mario Odyssey set the stage for a slew of non-standard Mario outfits, and while I can't remember if there was a Jurassic World specific outfit, there was definitely a dinosaur, so I feel safe going all in on this crossover. Now, in place of Mario's bright red long sleeve shirt, I've made his upper body out of fleshy pink clay so that I can give him a dark teal button-up with rolled up sleeves and an open collar for maximum Mario sex appeal.
That's a sentence I never thought I'd hear.
Unsettlingly sexy Mario baked again to cure the unbuttoned button-up, I can start to build his brown vest on top. It's easiest to make this in a few pieces, then join them at the seams, since it's really only the front and edges that need to be raised. Finally, I can add the final details like wrinkles and various tactical vest pouches. While I'm thoroughly enjoying the bald Mario look, and I think he's rocking the hell out of it, he does need a bit of hair to be both Mario and movie accurate, so I'll start building up the bald with little lumps of brown. I'd actually considered giving him a little Crocodile Dundee type hat, but decided that sometimes Mario doesn't need a hat, so instead I'm just going to give him his patent pending tufts of hair in the back and move on to making his hands. As I mentioned before, I ran out of white clay, so I'll have to make them out of gray and paint it later. But
Wait,
that
what did
actually,
he say?
as I mentioned before, I ran out of white clay, so I'll have to make them.
He said, I'll have to. I'll. Okay.
Out of gray and paint it later, but that actually works out well since it acts as easy shading when it comes time to add a little extra detail. I could have made his hands out of fleshy pink clay since I've got lots of that, but I've already made him without his red shirt and overalls, and I'm just not emotionally stable enough to deviate any further from the original design. So instead, gray painted white will have to do. Speaking of which, the sculpting is finished, which means I'm ready to start adding the various top coats, which I'll mostly do by repainting all the clay with color-appropriate glazes. This will add a bit of depth to the colors, and by letting the paint settle into the folds and wrinkles, it'll also help to add a bit of easy shading. Anytime I use colored clay, I like to repaint it afterwards to bring out all the surface details, and I generally use Vallejo Express colors since they're super vibrant, easy to apply, and they aren't reactivated by subsequent layers later. They're also not a sponsor, so if you're watching Mr. Vallejo, please send me lots of money to keep saying nice things. Once I've got my various colors added on top, I'll come back and finish Mario off by giving his lifeless white eyeballs some big beautiful blue peepers that get covered in a layer of UV resin. Otherwise, 6.5 minutes in, that's the first of 4 sculptures done, so it's time to get to work on some dinosaurs. Now, I knew I wanted to replace the raptors with Yoshi, but I wasn't sure what exactly to do as far as the design was concerned, so I turned to my delightful patrons who overwhelmingly voted for a set of 3 Yoshis, but as halfway amalgamations between raptors and the classic design. But tastefully done, you know?
I like tasteful.
Now, like Mario, Yoshi is pretty top-heavy on account of his oversized noggin, but unlike Mario, he's a little less stable on account of it not being located directly over his legs. To that end, I'm gonna need to make Yoshi a sturdy armature skeleton to stand on. As is often the case, though, poor planning in this stage is gonna come back to take the legs out from underneath me later, but like I said, that's later, and later is a problem for future Adam. Instead, right now Adam can confidently and contentedly create an aluminium monster to build up the bulk of Yoshi before slapping on a layer of clay to begin making the body. I'm going to be making the body out of gray clay since I don't really know what colors I'm going to be going with as far as my trio of Yoshis is concerned, and gray is a pretty neutral color to paint over top of later. Mostly I've just got a whole lot of gray clay, so using that up for a project that's pretty much two-toned in the end makes a whole lot more sense. Otherwise, as far as my Yoshi is concerned, I'll mark out where his hips will be, then I can do some final smoothing before slapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. The gloves come with pre-textured finger textures that are perfect for texturizing my monster's skin. They're also really useful at keeping my hands from getting clay all over them, which isn't generally a problem, but when I'm feeling particularly lazy, I tend to use isopropyl alcohol to clean clay off my hands, and at this point, I think I may have done some permanent damage to my epidermis. So a pair of texture-imparting, skin-saving blue gloves should tick both those boxes nicely. Now, as for Yoshi, I've added lots of little wrinkles and skin folds around his limbs and along his tail where it curves, and I'll start to create a separation between his underside and his overside, I guess? Topside? Whatever the underside isn't. Now, while the gloves impart some excellent minor surface texture, to add some larger scales and bumps, I'll use one of my many tryptophobia-inducing dot rollers to randomly add little lumps and bumps around the surface. I'll then wrap the body in some cling film and add lots of slices and cuts to add that ever-important dinosaur battle damage. Then it's into the oven to bake the body so I can get started on the head. Now, as is very much a theme on this channel, I didn't have much of a plan going into this, so to mount my head I need to add some extra wire, which I'll make by attaching an initial length of wire in addition to the existing wire. Then I can bend some shortened lengths around my ball stylus, so I have 2 sets of little armature wire hoops. And using lots of glue and finer wire, I can then stick these onto the exposed spinal armature, which will give me a nice sturdy surface to begin building the upper and lower jaws on top of. Yoshi's got a pretty substantial head with an oversized round nose, so having a bit of extra support by way of a sturdy armature wire is going to make my life a hell of a lot easier moving forward. I think in the future it'd be helpful if I left myself some extra wire on the tips of all my armatures to allow for over or underestimating sizes, but then I've been saying that since I started and I haven't changed yet. Otherwise, once I've got Yoshi's upper and lower jaws in place and somewhat shaped out, I can start to bulk up his head by adding little strategic lumps of clay until I'm left with a shape that I'm happy with. Then I can start to smooth it all out and put my gloves back on to apply some more texture while I add the wrinkles to his neck. To make his eyes, I'll poke some big old holes in the side of his head so that I can drop some little eyeballs in place. Then I can start to form the angry upper and bottom lids before covering them in a great big ocular ridge. I'll then stab the flat of my sculpting tool in the sides of his nose to make some breathing holes before adding some final scaly texture by way of roller. In order to make him a little less gummy, I need to add some gums so that I can stick some teeth in place. I've pre-baked these off camera so they'll keep their form as I jam them into his gums, and a little bacon bond will help them hold their position. I'll then add a little lip texture before getting to work on his tongue. Now I wanted to give Yoshi his patented chameleon tongue, so I'm going to wrap a thin layer of wire in some clay, then pinch and squeeze it and texturize it till it looks kind of like a tongue. Then I can roll it into an appropriate Yoshi tongue pose and jam it into the back of his throat before baking him once again and making some arms. I'll drill a couple holes around about where I think his arms would be, then stick some lengths of wire into place and wrap the tips with a little blob of clay. I can then start to build out the rest of his hands first by sticking a set of short sausages onto the blob and stabbing the tips with a tiny ball stylus for future finger stabbers before bending the arms into their final position so I can add the rest of the clay on top. I'll build up the bulk of the arms, then add some more wrinkles and skin folds around all the movie bits. Then I can stab some claws into the tips of his fingies before adding texture via a glove, roller, and silicone shaper. I was a bit premature with my original body baking since I forgot that I'd need to embed some spinal spikes along Yoshi's back, but that's easily remedied by adding a long wormy dealy along the length of his body and blending it in nicely. This will then give me a nice soft surface into which I can stab some grooves that I can then fill with those aforementioned spinal spikes. I've left a gap in the middle for the all-important Yoshi shell, which starts out as a big blob of clay that gets dropped into place. Then I can start to mark out the edge of the shell. It's a bit too thick though, so I'm going to remove some of the excess clay, then round it out again and get to work adding the turtle shell pattern on top. Otherwise, once the pattern is complete, I can bake Yoshi again before finally getting to work on his feet. Now, remember when I said my poor planning would take my legs out from underneath me? Well, that was my attempt at being clever, since what I did was make the armature too short for Yoshi's feet, and to fix it, I'll actually have to remove his legs. Fortunately, it's a relatively simple surgery, starting by marking out where I want to remove the leg, then once I've cut away the clay just below the knee, I'll unwrap the wire.
Right here, okay?
It's pretty tasteful, you know? Then it's just a case of repeating that entire process twice more to give me my final trio ready for painting. I'll start the painting process by giving Yoshi's belly and strong, scaly jawline a base coating of bone white by way of airbrush, since the idea of applying a dozen coats with a paintbrush makes my balls itch. I can then tackle the first of the Yoshis with a nice Yoshi green, hitting pretty much the entirety of the rest of the body, only trying not to get overspray on the already painted bone white bits. I'll then repaint the high spots with a yellow to add some vibrant and brighter green highlights over his body before repeating the same process with the next Yoshi, but this time with a dark blue followed by a not as dark blue. Finally, the final Yoshi is going to be pink, so, pink followed by brighter pink highlights. Now the insides of the mouth get a series of darker pinks, purples, and lighter pinks to add some variation before the tongues all get a deep red top coat, since Yoshi's all about that red tongue. While I've got the red on my brush, I'll give the shells a couple coats of red as well, and then tickle the spinal spikes with some red of their own before coming back with some lighter reds and pinks to add a bit of gradient so it's not quite so flat. Once all the more aggressive colors have been added, I can start to repaint all the lighter colored sections, starting with bone white on the tips of the shells as well as all the toenails and fingernails, which will then get recoated with a darker sepia wash. Finally, some final finishing touches get added with white, and I'll repaint all the teeth white, followed by a light dry brush of brown to give them some dirty detail, and I can paint the eyes white, then work my way through some orange and yellow, followed by some black slits to give them a spooky dino look. Last but not least, the requisite UV resin eyeball coating to give them some depth, and I'll give all the tongues and mouths a coat of high gloss varnish to really goop them up. Otherwise, that's my dino trio finally finished, which means it's time to get on to making my base. Now, as far as the base is concerned, it took me a lot longer to make all these sculptures, since, in a shocking twist, making 3 Yoshis took roughly 3 times as long as making 1 did. Fortunately, my goal was to recreate the Jurassic World meme with the 3 raptors, and upon closer inspection, they're all just standing on a big pile of wood chips. So I guess I'm making a big pile of wood chips. Of course, I don't have any wood chips, but what I do have are bamboo skewers and a coffee grinder. Now the beauty of bamboo skewers is that they're made of bamboo, and bamboo is a very fibrous wood, which means that if you were to, say, chop it up and blend it in a coffee grinder, you'll end up with some pretty convincing looking miniature wood chips. To attach my chips to my base and to add a bit of color underneath, I'll mix up a little bit of Mod Podge and brown and ochre paint, then slather it over the entire surface. Before it dries, I'll add a bit of sand for some reason, I guess, then layer on a thick pile of bamboo wood chips. To keep the chips in place, I'll give the entire surface a heavy dousing with isopropyl alcohol before giving it an even heavier coat of thinned out watery PVA glue. Once the glue dried, I made the mistake of thinking it would look better with a bit of darker shading, so I sprayed the entire base with a sepia ink, then immediately felt regret since I liked it better when it was a lighter color. However, there's no going back and I've run out of bamboo skewers, so I'm going to pretend like I meant to do it and I know what I'm doing. All that's left then is to stick my trio of Raptor Yoshis and my Mario Pratt in place, and that's us done, and on to the glamour shots.
This is pretty good.
While Mario Pratt and Yoshi Raptor spin in the background, let me take a minute.
Like I said before, this dude's got some fucking talent. So, we'll react to the Bowser one on Monday. So, I'll see y'all then. Have a good day.